here to begin with, as is taught by Je Lama Tsongkhapa, this life and body that we have right now are like sort of wavering, impermanent, like a water bubble. It's something that is quickly destroyed. So we should recollect the fact that we are going to have to die. And having died, we will follow after our sort of white and black karma in the way that a shadow follows after the body. So finding stable certainty in that, it says, please bless me to accomplish all positive virtuous actions, avoid all negative actions, and always be endowed with conscientiousness or awareness. So here, as it explains in this first line, our body, the sort of form that we have, as well as our life, the kind of the conjoined body and mind, when our body and mind exist in this kind of conjoined state, that's our life. These are impermanent. They're sort of wavering, subject to, by their very nature, impermanence and disintegration. So they're sort of like water bubbles. Like we can imagine when it rains and there are kind of puddles of water and more raindrops are dropping down, and it creates these little bubbles of air, or sort of bubbles on that water. They are very temporary. They sort of come up and then are dispersed very quickly. And so our body, our life are like that as well. Although we have this sort of sense that they are stable and lasting, this is actually something, as the verse continues, that is quickly destroyed. We are subject to having to die. We can't have this body forever. So death being the point at which this body and mind separate, we have to cast off this kind of life. And so again, this is describing the sort of situation that we have with this life that we have right now. Our body and our life are things that are impermanent, sort of like these little water bubbles that come up in a time where the rain is pouring down, and you can get these little sort of accumulation of bubbles, but they are going to quickly disperse. Our body too, our body and our life are something like that. We should recollect the fact that we are going to have to die. So here again, this life and body are impermanent, like a water bubble. They are quickly destroyed, and so we should recall death. We should think about death again and again. Again, death being that time when this body and mind that have been abiding together, those separate. And we should recall that it's not the case that after death, the continuity of the sort of form of our body is cut, or that our mental continuum is cut. The continuity of those will continue on. Our form changes state and goes this sort of separated from the mind, but the mind too will continue on. It's not the case that once we die, those continuums are cut. So here, as it continues, it says, after death, we will follow on our black and white karma, the way a shadow follows the body. So when you have, again, at the time of death and the body and mind are separated, the body, the sort of matter, will continue in its own continuum. And so too with the mind, although the more coarse sort of feelings and conceptualizations have subsided, there's that very subtle, clear light mind that is going to continue on. And the sort of after death, that mind will follow after our black and white karma, the way that a shadow follows the body. When you have the sunlight and your body and it casts a shadow, wherever your body goes, that shadow is going to follow. And so too, this mind will follow after the kind of white, those positive, good, virtuous karmas we have created, or those black, negative karmas that we have created. So if we have accumulated actions of abandoning, harming others, those sorts of positive, virtuous actions that are the opposite of the 10 non-virtuous actions. So instead of killing, we protect life, or instead of sexual misconduct, we hold to ethical conduct and so forth. If we, those are the sort of actions that will determine where we can go. So here we should find a strong kind of certainty that this is the case. After we die, there's nothing else that we can take with us. The body is separated away. We can't have that. We don't have any sort of wealth or possession that we can take with us, no family or friends or anyone else. But instead, all we have are the sort of seeds, those imprints, the latencies of those positive and negative actions that we have created in the past. And we should have strong certainty in this. So, finding strong certainty in that we are going to follow after our kind of black and white karmas. The verse continues saying that we should then abandon even the most kind of subtle of faults. So, anything on the 10 non virtues, anything that causes harm to others with our body, speech, and mind, the sort of most heavy actions leading to a birth, negative actions leading to a birth in the hell realms, the sort of medium leading to a birth as a hungry ghost, and the sort of lighter leading to a birth as an animal. Instead, we should be accumulating all positive actions, the kind of opposite of those 10 non virtues, recognizing that the future life that we take, again, if we find this kind of stable ascertainment or certainty that this is what our future rebirth, the life we are going to take is dependent upon, then we will really make effort to abandon even the most subtle kind of negative actions or faulty actions from the very intention to cause harm to another, and will make effort to accumulate all kinds of virtuous actions, those white or those positive sorts of actions of the 10 non-virtues, the 10 virtues and so forth. So here we're saying in this verse, expressing in this verse, the desire to always have kind of conscientiousness or awareness, to avoid any sort of negative actions from the very smallest ones, and to make that kind of effort to accomplish those positive actions that will lead to a good rebirth in the future. And along with this, we should have the recognition that since we have taken countless rebirths in the past, we have so too accumulated many previous non-virtuous actions, and taking the time to generate a kind of regret for those actions and engage in purification, along with the sort of practices of accumulating virtue through things like prostrations and offerings and so forth. This is the way in which we use this kind of recognition of death and impermanence, along with the sort of certainty in karma, to really make an effort at these actions. So then this verse ends with saying, please bless me to always have conscientiousness, this kind of awareness on a daily basis, being aware of the kinds of actions that we are engaging in. This kind of a conscientiousness is knowing what is a not suitable action, what is a suitable action, having in one's mind what is, and being careful of with respect to the kinds of things that we should adopt, that we should put into practice, and those things that we should avoid. And so here, by listening to the teachings, we should be requesting, may I have the blessings to create that kind of transformation wherein I have this sort of awareness. By listening to the teachings, may I be able to practice this on a regular basis. So here, the practice of abandoning the 10 non-virtues and adopting virtuous actions, doing things like these will bring about their kind of ripening results in our future lives. So by avoiding killing and sexual misconduct and stealing and lying and so forth, we are creating the kind of causes for a good ripening result of a rebirth as a human or a god in the future. But even aside from that, those kinds of results that will come in the future, even in this life, we will be much happier if we put these kinds of things into practice. If we are not driven in our motivations by jealousy and pride and anger and so forth, this is going to allow us to be happier right now in the temporary, like in the short term. Whereas the ripening result will sort of, that's the main thing that maybe we're focused on in terms of our practice. We should also recognize that getting rid of those kinds of faults of body, speech, and mind, that's something that will bring benefit. It said that, bringing a sort of temporary benefit as well as that kind of long-term sort of benefit. So here, the Dharma is often explained as being virtuous at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so here, again, even if our focus is on the kind of ripening results that practice will bring, this abandoning non-virtue will bring us happiness in this life as well. We'll be able to be more peaceful and harmonious and so forth with those around us. So, here, the reason for discussing and talking about the fact that one will not remain forever. Now, some thinking about this way in which we take birth and we have to die and so forth might think that it is to make one afraid or to make you sort of scared. But really, it's not about creating fear in one. Rather, it's in order to appreciate the kind of life that we have now by thinking about the sort of impermanence, the fact that we aren't going to remain forever. It makes us act in ways that are beneficial both to ourselves and to others. So here, it's not, of course, when we bring up the kind of word death or the concept of death, there's some sort of unhappiness that arises in our mind that we have to separate from this body and so forth. And so this is something that, however, we can see death around us directly. Like we can see that no generations of our family from the past remain. Everybody has to face this kind of fact of death. And so there are, again, some that when they hear these teachings, they sort of feel sort of discomfort at hearing about death. But when we recognize that we are not going to remain forever, of course, there's going to be some sort of sense of unhappiness, but it also leads us to make good use of the kind of life that we have, to be more loving and to generate more positive attitudes and so forth. We think, well, I need to do the Dharma right now while I have this kind of opportunity. And so it is by thinking about impermanence and death and the fact that our life will not remain forever that can kind of create a change in our mind. When we are able to recognize that we are impermanent, that we are not going to remain forever, then we will use our life in a sort of positive way. We will value that and take advantage of it in a way that when we get to the point of death, then one doesn't have to feel that kind of fear. If you have throughout your life acted in a way where you know that you have avoided negative actions for the most part, you have tried to accumulate positive actions, then at that time of death, you don't have to have that kind of fear or regret or trepidation. So reflecting upon death and impermanence during one's life can help make it more meaningful and also create the kind of change that allows one to be at peace at death. It is said that of the sort of very best practitioners actually feel a joy at the time of death. The sort of middling practitioners can die without regret, thinking like I have done well throughout my life. And at the very least, someone can die without a sense of fear, knowing that they have used their life in a kind of meaningful way. So again, talking about death and impermanence is not to create fear or scare you, but rather to actually alleviate that at the actual time of death. So here, by thinking in this way, reflecting upon the way in which we take birth, now some might have this kind of fear that arises from identifying maybe the self as being like the body. And so they feel like when they cast off their body or at death, they are going to become sort of non-existent. There's that kind of fear that can arise of the annihilation of the self. But if we don't have, if we have that kind of sense that there are past and future lives, that we are going to not be sort of ended at the time of death, but rather that we have to continue on, then our concern becomes about where we will be taking rebirth. And so here, this is really where that sort of transformation takes place. You don't have a fear at the kind of ending of the self, but rather where will I take rebirth and what will come in the future. And so here, this is one in this way, there are those who, though, even if one doesn't accept past and future lives, by sort of acting in a way wherein they are getting rid of those kinds of negative actions, those non-virtuous actions, they can benefit themselves in just this very life. If we act in a way in which we are trying to get what we need through cheating others, lying to them, stealing from them, deceiving them, and so forth, we're not going to be be happy even in this life. But someone who maybe they don't have full confidence in future lives, maybe they don't necessarily believe they're totally non-existent, but they're just not sure, like, well, is there a future life? They will be benefited in this very life by getting rid of those kinds of negative actions, as well as in their sort of future life. So here, our actions can become dharma if we act well based upon that kind of sense of wanting to get good results in the future. But even if we're not sort of sure about that, again, not being able to perceive something is not perceiving its non-existence. So for those who are not, we can't directly see our future lives. And so for some, that becomes a sort of point of contention. Are there going to be future lives? But even if they aren't sure, acting in a way that is in accordance with Dharma will bring good results in the temporary as well as in the longer term. And so here, we should think in this way that we're going to practice the Dharma, recognizing again that we are impermanent and wanting to avoid those kinds of negative results, but not just wanting to be freed from the lower realms. We also come to recognize that we want to get out of this cycle of taking up and casting off these aggregates, being driven by our karma and afflictions and this kind of uncontrolled cycle of rebirth. We'd rather get free of that kind of cycle of suffering. And this really involves attaining a kind of exhaustion of craving, getting rid of our attachment and hatred, and getting rid of, in the sort of 12 links of dependent origination, there's particularly that link, the 8th link of craving, and then the 9th of taking. So when we sort of are lacking the causes for continued rebirth, we're able to have an extinction of all of our suffering. So by abandoning the kind of sense of self and other that is based upon this strong holding to a self, holding to an I, and the kind of attachment and hatred that comes from that, by realizing the opposite of that, by realizing selflessness, by coming to understand emptiness, we can achieve a freedom from this kind of uncontrolled rebirth. So getting rid of that grasping at a self allows us to attain a kind of liberation. But we also reflect that that's not itself sufficient, because we look around at all other sentient beings who have acted as our mothers and fathers and see that from my own side, I want to be able to help these other sentient beings be able to achieve the same kind of liberation, to get rid of their attachment and anger that comes from this grasping at a self. And so therefore, I'm going to strive to attain this state of Buddhahood, a state in which one has freed oneself from all faults and attained all good qualities and has complete knowledge of all of the points to be adopted and abandoned. And in order to do that, I need to listen to the Dharma. And so thinking in this way, generating a kind of bodhicitta motivation, building up through these stages of thinking about rebirth in the lower realms, as well as one's own liberation, and extending then to the liberation of all sentient beings, being able to attain a state in which you have the ability to fully benefit other sentient beings. We should think in this way and set a proper motivation for listening to the Dharma. So here, picking up in the text from where we had left off last time, in the English translation, it's on page 18, beginning with the dependent arising of composite phenomena. So here, the Rice Seedling Sutra explains the dependent arising of a composite phenomenon by using a rice seedling as an illustration. And so if a rice seedling were produced without any causes or conditions, it would have to be produced constantly in all places, or it would never be produced anywhere at any time. So here, again, putting forth the example of a rice seedling, if it is the case that a rice seedling arises without any causes or conditions, then it would have to be it would sort of be produced in all places at all times. So it wouldn't be necessary to have the cause of the proper soil. You would be able to get a rice seedling from planting a seed on a snow mountain, or it would not be necessary to plant such that you give give rise to the fruits in summer, it would be viable to do so in winter as well. Because if something is causeless, then it would need to arise in all places at all times. If something arises only occasionally, given that there's like a certain place or a certain time, that means that it is dependent upon causes and conditions. If something doesn't, the opposite of that being that if something were to arise causelessly, then it would be produced at all times in all places or never anywhere at all. Instead, it is sometimes produced and sometimes not produced, so we can establish that it has causes and conditions. Then continuing, some might assert, as did some Indian philosophers, particularly like the Samkhya school, that the seedling already exists at the time of its causes and conditions, and that it is simply not yet manifest. So here, again, refuting the kind of philosophical schools that would assert a causeless production or the production from the sort of intent or thought of a creator and so forth. Here, it's decisive that because things arise occasionally, only in some places and at some times, then they must have causes and conditions. That establishes their causality. So going to those sorts of schools that do assert some kind of causality, the Samkhyas would say that things are sort of self-arisen, that actually the result, the seedling, exists at the time of the cause, the seed, and that so the seedling already exists at the time of its causes and conditions, and that it is simply not yet manifest. So here, this is the Samkhya's use the classic sort of example of like a mustard seed. They say that that the oil that you can get out of that must already exist at the time of the cause. Otherwise, it would. How could it come about when you say squeeze that in order to get the oil out of that mustard seed? And so this sort of leads to absurd conclusions to say that the effect is already existent at the time of the cause, just in an unmanifest sort of form. Buddhists would maybe come back with, well, then is it the case that and Samkhyas would accept that, say, yogurt and butter exist in that milk. If you have milk that has the ability to give rise to those things, those sorts of results already have to be there. They already have to exist at this time of the cause. So this is the kind of position of self-production. And so here, the problem that arises, as Buddhapalita has put forth, that if something is self-produced, or if the effect already exists at the time of the cause, then its production again would be senseless. So here, but if the seedling had already been produced and existed at that time, at the time of the cause, then it would be unnecessary for it to be produced yet again by its causes and conditions. So here, it's not the case that it's viable to say that the result already exists at the time of the cause, because then why does it need to be produced? Its production becomes senseless, becomes meaningless. On the other hand, if we postulate that the seedling's causal continuum is somehow broken and that it is produced from something other than its causal continuum, the effect, the seedling, would have to be independent of causes. So if you say then instead that, like, if you have the seed and the continuum of that seed or that substantial cause is somehow cut, and then that leads to the result, that too is not a viable kind of an option, because then there would be no connection between the cause and the result. So you could have, because those continuums would be cut, anything could produce anything. Fire could produce a rice seedling. A dry ground could produce a rice seedling. So here, this again, as it would be produced without any relationship to its causes and conditions, anything would be able to produce it. So here it continues in the text saying that nothing that is indivisibly unitary, unchangeably permanent, and substantially independent can give rise to an effect. So here, there are those kinds of Indian philosophical schools that assert things that are partless, whether that is a self that is partless or particles or time, moments of time. There are those Indian philosophical schools that assert things that are partless, unitary. For Buddhists, there's nothing that is partless. Anything that is a thing, that is a knowable object, has to have parts. So here, it continues by saying that thus causes with such characteristics as being indivisibly unitary, unchangeably permanent, and substantially independent can give rise to an effect. So causes with such characteristics cannot produce a rice seedling. So something, again, and there are Indian philosophical schools that assert things that are permanent, that are unchanging, that have this kind of existence that is self-sufficient and substantially existent, as opposed to the kind of existence of being merely imputedly existent, not having any kind of substantial existence, as is posited by the Madhyamakas and the Prasangika school in particular. But for the Samkhya's, something like this sort of principle, this underlying reality is something that is itself permanent. It acts as the cause for all of these impermanent things. But Buddhists would assert that no, it's not possible for something that is itself permanent to act as the cause of a particular result, particularly a impermanent result. So instead, the seedling must be produced from a cause that is a composite thing, that is composed of parts, is dependently arisen, has multiple parts, and changes every moment. So again, as we've discussed much in the past, therefore, as we will investigate in more detail in the next chapter, there can be no master of the world, no divine creator who creates the world merely by thinking it. The world is definitely created from causes and conditions. So already, and again, there are in India and other places where they sort of think of like, oh, well, what's going to happen to me after death is dependent upon what this God desires. Like they're sort of going to decide where I go. Again, that's not something that can be asserted to be a cause in this sort of understanding of Buddhists. It is instead, again, an assemblage of causes and conditions, such as the seed, water, fertilizer, warmth, and moisture that produces the seedling. This assemblage carries a capacity that corresponds with the production of its effect and is connected to the effect, the seedling, through a gradual transformation moment by moment. So it is impossible for this seedling to arise from a cause that does not itself undergo momentary change, or without this process of change contributing to the production of the effect. So again, it is the case that we have this kind of sense that we are not momentary, that we remain, like what the person who was here yesterday was here the day before, and so forth. But if we look at this, if we examine, like, do we have the same sort of minds that we had when we were in our mother's womb, or even when we were very small children, we can't even hardly recognize those. We see, like, sort of over the period of, say, 10 years, we can notice, oh, a change happened in those 10 years. Well, if a change happened in 10 years, then a change must have happened in 5 years. A change must have happened in 2 years. A change, and we go smaller and smaller until we realize that everything has to be momentary. Nothing can be static and remaining for any moment in order for it to be efficacious, in order for it to be able to bring about results. So the causes of something that is impermanent and momentary themselves need to be constantly undergoing this sort of process of change. So here again, it is only when the sort of substantial cause and all the coordinating conditions come together that there's the ability to bring forth an effect. We can see that effects arise from their various causes that are in this way, again, not partless, having parts, are impermanent and are not substantially existent. So here, then, a cause has the quality of producing the entity of its effect. That's really what we define a cause as. It has that ability to produce that entity of its effect. In other words, it has the property of reaching for its effect. So the only way for a cause to produce its effect is through a gradual process of transformation of the cause. So here, when we talk about like planting a seed and getting a rice seedling, it's based upon the sort of continuity that when we plant that seed and have that substantial cause, and then all of the kind of proper coordinating conditions, we can bring about a sprout. The seed sort of holds that potential or the property of reaching for its effect. But when it is combined with the proper sort of coordinating conditions, it can transform into the particular effect. Again, this sort of rice seedling. So here again, given that an effect cannot occur without some aspect of the cause undergoing transformation, there can be no cause that becomes the effect, its effect directly. So here, it is this sort of transformation that leads to a particular result. It's not like the cause itself becomes the result, nor, as we'll see below, is it due to the sort of cutting of the continuum of the cause that then allows the result to come about. But when we think about it, like for example, when we talk about taking a future life, and we think about like, oh, I want to become a god in the future, we sort of almost think that it's like this body or this person that we have now that will become a god, or like the thing that we have right now. But that's not actually the case. The sort of transformation of going from one rebirth to the next is not quite like the sort of way that we imagine it. There are lots of sort of examples of this when we can talk about, and this word sort of transformation is the same word that we use like poa, like when we're moving from one life to another. So we could give examples of like the moon. Just by the moon existing there, it's able to cast a form in whatever sort of reflective surface there might be. It's not as though the moon somehow moves there or somehow gives something to each of those, but rather by its mere existence, it is able to produce those kinds of reflections in everything. Or one could use the example of like if you see someone who is eating something really sour, even though you don't put that kind of sour thing in your own mouth, just by seeing that other person, you can start to salivate because you see the sort of look on their face of they're having eaten this really sour thing. So again, what is it that really came about and created that salivating in your mouth? We can't talk about that the sort of thing. It's the cause itself becoming the effect, but rather there's this kind of transformation that's really important here. Or for example, one good thing about it too, like if you have something that you are reciting, and by you reciting it many, many times, someone else is then able to pick up on that and they can now recite that by heart. What sort of transformation took part there? You didn't give them your words or give them your knowledge or so forth. So anyway, these are some of the ways that we should think about the cause undergoing transformation, because there's no cause that becomes its effect directly. There's a transformation involved. Nevertheless, it is not the case that an effect occurs only after the cause has completely ceased to exist, such that the continuum of the cause has been cut. So it's also not the case that there's this sort of unrelated, the continuum of the cause is cut, and then we have the coming about of the result. But rather it is like the two sides of a scale, where when the one side goes down, the other side simultaneously goes up. When the cause ceases to exist, the effect occurs simultaneously. So therefore, the effect arises in a way that is linked to the cause. So, like we see with a sort of scale, if you're measuring kilos or pounds or whatever it may be, and one side goes up, the other side goes down. This is the same kind of process of transformation, of simultaneity between the ceasing of the cause and the effect coming into being. So here, then it continues, saying, in this manner, a seedling does not exist at the time of its causes and conditions. That is to say, it does not exist simultaneously with its cause. So when we think about a sprout or a seedling coming into being, it's not something that already existed at the time of the cause, like the sort of self production, or the kind of idea of the Samkhya that the result exists at the time of the cause. And it doesn't arise sort of from itself. It doesn't come from its own kind of being, in the way, again, that the Samkhyas assert some kind of self-production. And when we see, say, sprouts arising in a field, it seems like, oh yeah, those seeds are giving rise to those sprouts. There's a sense of their coming from a particular kind of self-arisen cause. But it's not actually the case that they come about in that way. Rather, it is only due to the kind of aggregation of the proper causes and conditions, having that sort of the continuum of that substantial cause affected by various conditions that sort of adventitiously, that those, when they come together, something is produced. And so it continues saying that, moreover, it does not come from somewhere else later on. It's not the case that the effect comes from somewhere other than its particular cause, but rather a seedling is a dependent arising that appears and disappears like a magician's illusion. It arises suddenly, composed from causes at a certain point in the continuum of momentary transformations of its causes. And when it ceases to exist, it does not go somewhere else. So we have this kind of like idea that things seem to be sort of stable and static, but really when we examine causes and conditions, there's no stability. Nothing is static, but they're constantly undergoing this kind of momentary transformation. And so when we point to a sort of certain point in the continuum, it's undergoing these kinds of transformations on a momentary basis. So we can point to something and call it a cause and then an effect later on. But here, like when we, for example, see a flag or a prayer flag flapping in the wind, it seems like that flag is sort of flapping on its own. But again, it's only due to the sort of causes and conditions, having the proper wind, and so forth. In the absence of that, it's not going to come into being. So here, again, it's impossible for any effect or cause to be established independently. These are mutually dependent. And all transformations within a continuum do not arise and cease on their own, but they do so by the power of their specific causes and conditions. So here, in the collection of causes and conditions, there is a constant change or flux. They are never static. So this is, again, there is no sort of thing, an effect that can exist at the time of the cause, but rather it is something that comes about through this momentary, moment-to-moment kind of transformation due to the aggregate, the coming together of particular causes and conditions. So then similarly, in the same manner, a rice seedling is not produced in isolation, but from the transformation that is the dependent arising of its causes and conditions. Again, no independent divine creator or master of the universe is involved. It's not the case that if all of the causes and conditions are assembled, something needs the sort of divine inspiration or the thought of some kind of divine creator for it to come about. It's a dependent arising that comes from its causes and conditions, and there's no other sort of a divine creator involved. So here too, it says a rice seedling is momentary in the sense that the rice seedling of the first moment has ceased to exist in the second moment of the rice seedling. So the second moment of the rice seedling did not exist previously. It was not, so here, again, it was produced newly and adventitiously from its causes and conditions. That is, from both a preceding moment that is a part of the continuum of rice seedling moments that are similar type, and conditions such as warmth, moisture, and air. So again, the sort of preceding moment that is a part of a continuum of a rice seedling, that's the sort of substantial cause, as well as those coordinating conditions such as warmth and moisture and air, all of those things being necessary to actually produce that particular effect. So it's not the case that a portion of the rice seedling's continuum that has already been produced lingers on, but rather it is newly produced in every moment of that kind of continuum. So here again,
National.
it is in dependence upon kind of momentary causes that we give rise to effects that are similarly momentary. Things are constantly disintegrating moment to moment. There's no sort of static, nothing that can remain in the sense of being permanent and unchanging. But rather, causality is such that it is momentary. That things are constantly sort of disintegrating. And so for some non-Buddhists, they would think like, well, how is it possible for things that are momentary like that to bring about any kind of result? How can we possibly talk about karma working or past and future lives or have a sort of continuity of anything if things are momentary, if they're just sort of changing moment to moment to moment? But in response to that, the Buddhists would actually assert that it is only because things are momentary that they can bring about some kind of cause. It is precisely because they aren't sort of static and permanent that one can have efficacy, any kind of result coming from its proper sort of cause. So if we take, for example, like electricity, electricity is not something that is static. It is something that is changing moment to moment to moment. But it is the case that we can use electricity to power a light, to turn on a light, and use that light for reading and so forth. And although that is not static, it is something that is changing moment to moment to moment. And the current of electricity that is going to that light bulb is something that itself is momentary and is not permanent or static or remaining in any kind of way. We can still, due to the sort of continuity of that particular result, that light, we can use it to read books and see things and so forth. So here, there is a verse from Aryadeva's 400 about the kind of fact that our life is something that is momentary. Right now, we are alive, and it is only due to being momentary, really, that we are alive. We can see more easily how it is that our mind is changing moment to moment. But we don't have this sort of sense. We don't realize actually the way in which we are momentary. Our life is momentary. So here, we generally all of us have a sense of kind of like permanence, like we remain the same day to day, even. But when we actually sort of look and examine, it is only because of our body and mind being composed of various elements that are themselves impermanent and momentary that we can speak of being alive. We need to have this kind of constant change and movement. We can see that we need to breathe, we need to eat. Even if we say have something like our blood isn't pumping for one moment, we're not able to stay alive. We are composed of these six elements, again, those being earth, fire, water, wind, empty space, and then consciousness. Again, so when we talk about empty space, I mean, think about we need to have those sort of spaces within our body to be able to fill our lungs and so forth. So there's so many various causes and conditions, moment to moment to moment, that are necessary for for us to be alive. Yet we don't recognize that. We don't recognize that we are in fact momentary. We tend to see ourselves as sort of static and unchanging. Now we're maybe able to observe those coarse kinds of impermanence sort of change over a longer duration of time. But really, we don't normally recognize or understand the way in which we are actually changing moment to moment to moment, that we are momentary and that our very life is only possible because it is momentary. So then, therefore, all
Appreciate it.
external and internal composite things, again, rice seedlings, people, thoughts, are produced in dependence on an aggregation of their multiple and varied causes and conditions, which are specific to each thing, composed of parts and ever changing. Here, again, whatever kind of thing it is, and we've used an example of like a rice seedling or rice sprout, but whatever sort of internal or sort of external things in the external world, or the kind of internal things, the person, the feelings, and so forth, come about due to an aggregation of causes and conditions. And we have then something that is designated or imputed independence upon its basis of imputation. So when these things are produced, whatever composite thing it is impossible for them to be produced as singular partless things. Again, when we have something like, you could take, for example, a tree, we designate tree on the collection of various parts of like a stalk and the sort of bark and the leaves and the branches and so forth. It's not just like one thing. It's rather a collection of various kind of parts that we then designate tree, or like a house. When we designate something as a house, that is the extent of its existence. If you then try to look within those various parts, within that basis of designation, it's impossible to find the thing so designated. So here it says, since any effect is produced only from an assemblage of multiple and varied parts, it is impossible for it to come into being without depending or relying on a collection of parts, which is its basis of imputation. So here, this term basis of imputation, like for example, when we have something like a house and the collection of the various walls and windows and all of that, that is the basis of imputation. Or like for a cow or an oxen, the collection of those various parts that we then identify as being a particular thing. So you have the basis of designation, that collection of parts, and then the thing which is designated or imputed on it. This is only, again, any effect is produced from an assemblage of multiple and varied parts, and it is impossible for it to come into being without depending or relying upon that collection of parts, that basis of imputation. So, then here, we turn to this section on different interpretations of how an effect depends on its causes. So it says here that since even essentialists, so those who say that the identity of individual phenomena relies on their possessing a fixed essence or nature, assert that effects arise in dependence on their causes, they must ultimately deny any mode of existence that is independent of causes and conditions, just as consequentialists do. So here, again, essentialists are those that say that the identity of individual phenomena relies on their possessing a fixed essence or nature. This can take on various forms, but even within the Buddhist schools, we see like the particularists, or like the Vaibhashikas, the Sutra school, the mind-only school. They assert a dependent origination, but they also assert this kind of fixed identity or true existence. And so someone might have this kind of question, well, just like the consequentialists assert dependent origination, so too do those essentialist schools. So how do consequentialists differ from essentialists with respect to their understanding of the dependent arising of composite phenomena? So here, again, there are different sorts of views that are taken by these essentialists. Different essentialists make various assertions with regard to composite phenomena. Some say that things arise causelessly. So there are those, again, like the Charvakas, or those types of sort of hedonist kind of schools that believe things arise causelessly. Whereas others assert various discordant causes, such as a divine creator, a partless particle, a permanent principle called time, a principle nature, or a permanent being. So all of those sort of positions can be subsumed into these four alternatives. Again, being production from self, that effects arise from causes that are the same nature as themselves. Production from other, effects arise from causes that exist in and of themselves. Production from both self and other, and production from no causes. So here, again, those sorts of essentialists would assert that production needs to fall into one of these four. We see there are those that assert like self-production, like the Samkhyas and so forth, or things coming from a sort of principal nature and dissolving back into that. And there are others who would assert that there is a production from an other, an inherently existent other. Now, this again is sort of refuted by the famous line from Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on wisdom, where he says that there's nothing whatsoever that arises from self, from other, from both self and other, or from neither self nor other. So here we should take that and understand that as refuting all four of these kinds of types of production. Now, there are those who would say that one needs to apply the kind of qualifier of ultimately. They would say that things are produced from another, but not an ultimately existent other. Now, for Jilama Tsongkhapa, he really applies that kind of qualification of an other, things are not produced from an other that exists from its own side. So here, again, this neither of these, none of these four modes of production are accepted as valid, with even without the kind of qualification of ultimate, although from its own side. So uh, that production of effects via these four alternatives is unfeasible, has already been explained above. Therefore, although essentialists say that effects arise in dependence on their causes, they do not, in fact, assert how effects do arise, how they arise from causes that are concordant with them. So here, then again, those who are following after, again, there are outsiders who don't accept the kind of system presented by Buddhists. They don't accept the idea of selflessness or that there is no creator and so forth. So for those who are really outside of the system of the Buddha's teachings, as Gelama Tsongkhapa has said in his verses on the praise of dependent origination, being enslaved by ignorance, those who fiercely oppose you, what is so astonishing about their being unable to bear the sound of no intrinsic existence? So those kinds of schools that assert that there is some kind of intrinsic existence, or they're really enslaved by their various views that are totally in opposition to the views of the Buddha, it's not really astonishing that they are unable to bear the sound of there being no intrinsic existence. It's not something that they can really fathom or get behind. But continuing into the next verse, he then addresses those who claim to be followers of the Buddha, but yet are not able to accept emptiness. So here it continues saying, but having accepted dependent origination, like those lower schools, the Vaibhashikas, the Sutra school, the mind-only school, the precious treasure of your speech, this thing that is so precious, that is like a treasure of the Buddha's speech, having accepted that dependent origination, then not tolerating the roar of emptiness, this I find amazing indeed. So it is more sort of strange or amazing that those who accept the idea of dependent origination are there not able to bear with the idea of emptiness. This is sort of that is something that he's expresses his amazement at.